In May 2016, after returning from a military deployment, I was desperate for a break. The stress of the past year had worn me down, and a relaxing vacation sounded like heaven. My girlfriend, Lauren, and I booked a cruise to Mexico. It was supposed to be simple: sun, cocktails, and maybe a little adventure. But what started as a dream trip turned into something I'll never forget, and not in a good way. On the second stop of the cruise, we docked in Cozumel. Lauren wasn't feeling well, so she decided to stay on the ship. I felt guilty leaving her behind, but I didn't want to miss out entirely. I figured I'd grab some authentic Mexican food and be back before she even noticed I was gone. As soon as I stepped off the ship, I was greeted by the usual chaos: vendors shouting about tours, restaurants offering deals, and taxi drivers vying for attention. One of them, a man in his late 40s with a kind smile, approached me. He spoke decent English and offered to take me to a local gem of a restaurant that tourists didn't know about. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I thought, why not? After all, part of traveling is about experiencing things off the beaten path. The first few minutes of the drive were uneventful. He played upbeat music and chatted about his family and the area. But then, we turned off the main road onto a narrower, dirtier street. I noticed fewer buildings, fewer people. The excitement I'd felt earlier started to wane. "Is this the shortcut?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Yes, he said with a nod, his smile unwavering. "We are almost there." I stared out the window, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the road kept getting worse: potholes, overgrown bushes, and an unsettling emptiness. Eventually, we stopped in front of a shabby, dimly lit building that barely looked like a restaurant. A few men were sitting outside, smoking and watching me with expressions I couldn't read. "This is it?" I asked, trying to mask my hesitation. "Yes, the best food," the driver said. He gestured for me to get out of the car, and I reluctantly followed. Inside, the restaurant smelled faintly of grease and mildew. The menu was handwritten on a piece of cardboard, and the only other patrons were two men at the back, speaking quietly and glancing at me every so often. My discomfort grew with every passing second. I ordered something simple, a taco plate, and tried to eat quickly, but my stomach was too knotted with unease. When I finished, I told the driver I was ready to leave. He nodded, but didn't say much as we got back into the car. Instead of retracing our route, he turned onto another road, even narrower and darker than the first. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This way is faster," he said, but there was something off about his tone. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, but it wasn't picking up a signal. Panic started to set in. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the jungle, with no signs of life in any direction. I made a snap decision. I had to get out of the car. "Stop!" I shouted. "I need to get out!" The driver hesitated, but when he saw the look on my face, he pulled over at a small intersection. I threw some pesos at him, grabbed my phone, and started walking down the road in the opposite direction. I didn't know where I was going, but anything was better than staying in that car. After what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance. It was a small gas station, a beacon of hope in the middle of nowhere. I ran inside, out of breath and visibly shaken. The man behind the counter looked at me with concern as I tried to explain what had happened. "You're lucky," he said in broken English. "That road, very dangerous. Sometimes bad people take tourists there. You did good to leave." I don't know what the driver's intentions were. Robbery? Something worse? And I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I managed to catch a ride back to the cruise port with a shuttle driver and made it back to the ship just in time. Lauren could tell something was wrong the moment she saw me. Our trip was supposed to be an escape, but instead, it left me with a story I wish I didn't have to tell. Mexico had always been part of my life. My family would take road trips down from Texas to visit relatives, and even though I had done it a dozen times growing up, One particular trip stuck with me because it was the first time I realized how quickly things could go wrong. I was about 25 when it happened. My parents, younger brother, and I had planned a trip to visit my grandmother's old hometown near Monterey. We were driving from the US, making a few stops along the way. The plan was simple: drive down, visit some family, and take a scenic route through some smaller towns my dad wanted to show us. Everything was smooth until our last full day. We had spent the morning exploring a small, colorful pueblo, eating street tacos, and soaking in the quiet charm of rural Mexico. Around 4 p.m., we started our drive to a hotel where we'd stay for the night before crossing back into the States the next day. It was a long stretch, mostly highway, with nothing but desert and the occasional gas station. An hour in, the car started acting up. First, a weird clicking noise, then a sudden jolt. My dad pulled over, popped the hood, and immediately started cursing. "Great," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's overheating." My mom checked her phone, but there was barely any signal. I stepped out and scanned the area. Nothing but dry land and open road. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty highway. Then we saw it. A truck, an old, rusty one, approaching from the opposite direction. My stomach tightened. I don't know why, but something about it put me on edge. I kept telling myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a good Samaritan. The truck slowed down and stopped a few feet ahead of us. 3 men got out. They looked rough, the kind of guys you wouldn't want to mess with. Sun-beaten faces, worn clothes, and expressions that didn't give much away. One of them, the oldest, smiled and greeted my dad in Spanish. "¿Necesitan ayuda?" Dad hesitated before nodding. "Sí, el coche está fallando." The men walked over, glancing into our car as they did. I caught one of them looking a little too long at my mom and brother in the back seat. That's when my gut started screaming that something was wrong. At first, they poked around under the hood like they were trying to help, but then their questions changed. "Where are you coming from? Are you heading home? You carrying cash?" They were small questions, casual, but they set off alarm bells in my head. My dad must have felt it too, because he straightened up and suddenly seemed a lot more alert. "We're fine now," he said quickly. "Thanks for stopping, but we've got it under control." The 3 men exchanged glances. One of them, younger and stockier, shifted his weight slightly, like he was waiting for a cue. My mom whispered something to me in Spanish, something about getting back in the car, locking the doors. The old man studied my dad for a second longer before flashing another smile. "Bueno, good luck." And just like that, they turned and walked back to their truck. We didn't breathe until they were gone. As soon as the truck disappeared down the road, my dad hurried to fix whatever he could on the car. We were back on the highway within minutes, but I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. Later that night, after we reached the hotel, my dad admitted he'd heard stories about groups like that. Men who pretend to help stranded drivers, but actually have way worse intentions. Sometimes they rob people. Sometimes people disappear. I don't know what those men were planning, but I know one thing: we got lucky. Alex and I had been planning our Mexico trip for months. We wanted something different, not the usual touristy spots, but somewhere peaceful, scenic. So when we found a beautiful Airbnb in the hills outside Oaxaca for half the price of a hotel, we jumped on it. The photos were stunning: white stucco walls, a rustic wooden interior, a huge terrace overlooking miles of green valleys. The reviews were all positive, and the host, an older woman named Esperanza, seemed friendly. When we arrived, the house looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better. Esperanza greeted us at the gate, her weathered hands gripping the keys. "You're very lucky," she told us in Spanish. "This house has a lot of history." She said it in a way that made it sound like a warning. That first day, we explored a bit, made dinner, and sat on the terrace drinking mezcal. It was quiet, almost too quiet. By midnight, we were exhausted and ready to crash. Then the knocking started. It was light at first, tap, 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 on the window near the front door. Alex and I looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Before I could answer, another knock. This time, from the bedroom window. Alex grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, but when he shined it outside, nothing was there. The house was completely isolated, no neighbors, no nearby roads, just miles of trees and hills. "Maybe it's an animal," I suggested, but I didn't even believe it myself. The knocking stopped, but something about the silence felt worse. The next day, we told Esperanza about it. She just smiled, like she had expected it. "Sometimes they visit," she said. I didn't ask who they were. That night, the knocking came back. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was knocking, scratching, something pressing against the door. Then, the doorknob rattled. Alex grabbed the knife from the kitchen, and I reached for my phone to call the police. But of course, no service. The landline in the house didn't work either. We spent the whole night awake, too scared to move. At dawn, the noises stopped. We ran outside, hoping to find footprints, something to prove we hadn't imagined it. The only thing we found was the front gate, which had been locked the night before, standing wide open. We packed our bags in record time. As we loaded up the car, I glanced back at the house and saw Esperanza standing at the terrace, watching us with that same unreadable smile. "You should not have come here," she said softly. We didn't ask questions. We didn't want to know the answers. We drove back to the city and booked a last-minute hotel for the rest of the trip. I don't know if what we experienced was some kind of supernatural presence or something more human and sinister. All I know is that sometimes, when a place is too cheap to be true, there's a reason.